Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Earthly Delights. If you love houseplants, dream about a fuller garden, save every healthy stem instead of throwing it away, and still feel frustrated when a cutting turns brown in a glass of water, then this video is for you. Maybe you have tried propagating on a kitchen windowsill. Maybe you have watched a stem for days, hoping for roots, only to end up with mushy rot and disappointment. And maybe you have quietly wondered, why does nature make new life look so easy while I keep losing simple cuttings at home? Years ago, I heard a story about a biology teacher who had spent 3 decades in the classroom and kept more than 200 thriving plants. After her first year, she hardly bought another one. She simply multiplied what she already had. When people asked for her secret, she gave the same calm answer every time. I just gave them the conditions they already know. That stayed with me because it sounds poetic, but it is actually practical. It points to a simple method rooted in plant science, not luck. A method that costs almost nothing, takes only minutes to set up, and can change the way you propagate forever. In this video, I'm going to show you why water propagation fails so often, what plants really need at the rooting stage, and how a simple humidity box can help you clone dozens of plants for free. So before we get into the science and the step-by-step process, make sure you subscribe to Earthly Delights, and let's dig into it together. 1. The Great Water Propagation Myth. Now let's talk about the part that frustrates so many growers. Why do we keep putting cuttings in water? Because it feels easy, it looks clean, and there is something satisfying about watching roots appear in a clear glass. But when that same cutting collapses after 2 or 3 weeks, I want you to hear this clearly, that is not always a skill problem. More often than not, it is an environment problem. The moment a cutting is submerged in water, it enters a low oxygen setting. The plant responds by adapting, because plants always try to survive first. Instead of building the kind of roots that are meant to anchor into airy growing media, it starts producing water roots, soft, delicate structures designed for life in constant moisture. These roots can function in water, yes, but they are fragile. They do not have the same toughness, the same protective surface, or the same fine root hairs that help a plant settle confidently into soil. And that is where the disappointment begins. After weeks of patient care, you move that cutting into potting mix, expecting it to take off. But the roots that formed in water are suddenly pressed into a denser, heavier world. The tiny air spaces collapse, oxygen drops, and rot can move in fast. So what looked like success was often only a temporary adaptation. We thought we were helping the plant prepare for life in soil, when in reality we were training it for a completely different environment. That is why so many people lose confidence with propagation. But once you understand what is really happening, you stop blaming yourself and start changing the conditions. And that brings us to the method that makes all the difference. 2. The physics of humidity and the $3 miracle box. If water is not the best place to start most cuttings, then what is? The answer is humidity, high, steady humidity that protects the cutting while it does its most important early work. When you take a fresh cutting, the plant immediately begins trying to form new roots from the node. That is where the growth energy gathers, guided by a natural rooting hormone called auxin. But at the exact same time, the cutting is losing moisture through its leaves to the surrounding air. So now you have a race. The cutting is trying to build roots before dehydration drains its strength. In ordinary room air, that race is often lost before it truly begins. The solution is simple, affordable, and surprisingly effective. When you place a cutting inside a closed space with humidity above 80%, moisture loss slows dramatically. The cutting is no longer struggling just to stay alive. Instead, it can direct its stored energy where you want it most, right into root formation at the node. That is the real beauty of this method. You are not forcing the plant. You are removing the stress that keeps it from doing what it already knows how to do. And this is where the little miracle box comes in. A basic plastic storage container with a lid, the kind you can pick up for a few dollars at almost any store, creates that stable, humid environment beautifully. Set it up properly, and you have a miniature greenhouse sitting right on your kitchen table. Small, simple, and powerful enough to change the way you propagate from this point forward. The anatomy of the perfect substrate, perlite. So now that we have the box, the next question is just as important. What do we put inside it? And this is where many gardeners make a costly mistake. We do not fill this box with regular potting soil. Wet soil may seem natural, but inside a closed, humid container, it can become dense very quickly. Once that happens, the tiny spaces that should hold oxygen begin to disappear, and those tender young roots are left struggling in a heavy, airless environment. What we want instead is a medium that can hold moisture without smothering the cutting. That is why I reach for perlite. Perlite is a form of volcanic glass that has been heated until it expands into those light, white, porous pieces you see in propagation mixes. It is clean, sterile, airy, and incredibly useful at this stage. Its structure creates countless little pockets of air while still drawing moisture upward around the stem. That means the cutting gets the humidity and hydration it needs, but the forming roots can still breathe freely. And that balance is everything. Too dry, and the cutting collapses before it roots. Too dense, and it rots before it has a chance. Perlite solves both problems with remarkable simplicity. It gives the plant what so many living things need in order to grow well. Enough moisture to stay alive, and enough space to keep breathing. Once you understand that, the rest of this system becomes beautifully straightforward. 4. The 4-step master protocol. And the good news is, setting it all up takes almost no time at all. In fact, once you have your materials ready, this whole system comes together faster than most people make their morning coffee. First, take your clear plastic box and fill it with about 3 to 4 inches of perlite. Then add water slowly until the perlite feels evenly moist. When you squeeze a handful, it should clump lightly, but it should never be dripping. If it is too wet, simply press out the excess. You are aiming for moisture, not saturation. Next, choose a healthy stem from your mother plant, ideally about 4 to 6 inches long. Make a clean cut just below a node, the small point where a leaf joins the stem. That node is where the cutting has the best chance to produce new roots, because it is already a natural center of growth. After that, remove the lower leaves and leave only the top 2 or 3 in place. Those upper leaves will continue gathering light and fueling the cutting, but any foliage buried too low in the humid box is likely to soften, rot, and invite disease. Then insert the cutting 1 to 2 inches deep into the moist perlite and close the lid firmly. That is it. In a surprisingly short time, the container will begin doing the work for you. Check the lid after a couple of hours. If you see tiny beads of condensation forming, you have created the humid microclimate the cutting needs. At that moment, you have done exactly what that biology teacher meant all along. You have given the plant the conditions it already understands. 5. The 3 fatal sins of propagation. Now, before you start filling boxes with cuttings, I need to warn you about the 3 mistakes that ruin this method for otherwise careful growers. And the truth is, these mistakes usually come from good intentions. The first is opening the lid too often. Curiosity is natural. We all want to peek, check progress, and make sure everything looks all right. But every time you crack that box open, you release the humidity that the cutting depends on. You interrupt the very environment that is protecting it. In the early stage, leave the box sealed for at least 7 days and let the system stabilize. This is one of those moments in gardening where patience is not passive, it is productive. The second mistake is going back to potting soil. Even a quality mix is still heavier, less sterile, and more likely to hold pathogens than pure perlite in this setup. If the goal is to create a safe, airy rooting chamber, then consistency matters. Stick with 100% perlite for this stage. The third mistake is placing the box in direct sun. Many people assume more light is always better, but a closed plastic container under hot sun can heat up shockingly fast. Instead of becoming a propagation chamber, it becomes an oven. Bright, indirect light is what you want. Enough to support the leaves, but gentle enough to keep the cuttings cool and steady. Get those three things right, and you remove most of the common reasons cuttings fail before they ever have a fair chance to root. 6. The plant matrix, fast and steady rooters. So now that you understand the setup, the next question is the one every gardener asks. What actually roots well in this little box? This is where the plant matrix becomes so helpful, because not every cutting moves at the same pace. Some plants are eager, fast, and forgiving. Others take a little more time and a steadier hand. Tier 1 is your easiest group, the soft-stemmed plants and familiar herbs. Think basil, mint, rosemary, lavender, and pothos. These are the cuttings that usually respond quickly when the humidity is right and the stem is healthy. In a setup like this, they often begin rooting within 7 to 10 days, and they do it with impressive reliability. Once you see that happen, propagation stops feeling mysterious and starts feeling practical. A single healthy basil plant, for example, can give you cutting after cutting across the growing season, turning one plant into many without another trip to the garden center. Tier 2 includes the semi-woody plants, the ones that need a little more patience but are still well worth the effort. Hydrangeas, begonias, and soft new rose growth fit beautifully into this category. These usually take closer to 10 to 15 days, and while they may not root quite as fast as the softer herbs, they reward consistency. This is where home gardeners really begin to see the power of propagation. That rose stem you trim back in summer does not have to be yard waste. Under the right conditions, it can become the beginning of an entirely new plant. And that is such an important shift in mindset. You do not always need to buy more plants to build a fuller garden. Often, the real value is already growing in the pots and beds you have. 7. The challengers and the exceptions. Then we come to Tier 3, the challengers. These are the slower, woodier cuttings, plants like boxwood, holly, and butterfly bush. They can root in this system, but they ask for more patience and a little more acceptance that not every cutting will make it. These often take around 14 to 21 days, sometimes longer depending on the plant, the season, and the condition of the mother stock. But even here, the math still makes sense. One healthy new shrub from a cutting can save you far more than the small cost of setting up this propagation box in the first place. At the same time, good gardeners learn to respect limits. Not every plant wants this environment. Succulents, for example, generally dislike high humidity and are much more likely to rot than root under these conditions. Bulbs and seeds follow very different biological pathways, so they belong to another conversation entirely. And perhaps most important of all, no propagation method can fully overcome a weak starting point. If the parent plant is diseased, stressed, or failing, the cutting is likely to carry those problems with it. Strong new growth begins with a healthy mother plant, actively growing and full of life. That is the foundation everything else depends on. 8. The grand transition from box to soil. And then, finally, comes the moment everyone waits for. The day you open the lid and find healthy roots pushing through the perlite. It is satisfying, exciting, and honestly a little hard not to rush. But this is exactly where patience still matters. One of the most common mistakes is moving a cutting on too early, simply because roots have appeared. A few early roots are a good sign, but they are not always enough for a smooth transition into potting mix. What you really want is a root system that is 2 to 4 inches long, with enough secondary branching to help the plant cope with its new environment. That extra time makes a real difference. You are not just waiting for roots to show up, you are waiting for them to become capable. And if you are working with a more stubborn cutting, there is a gentle way to bridge the gap. Over the course of about a week, you can begin adding a small amount of unfertilized potting soil into the moist perlite, gradually turning the rooting medium into a light slurry. This soft transition helps the cutting adjust before it ever faces full potting mix. It is a quieter, kinder handoff from one stage to the next. In many ways, that is how real growth works, not through sudden shock, but through gradual adaptation handled with care. The philosophy of growth. When you step back and look at the whole method, it is almost astonishing how simple it is. One small box can hold 6, sometimes 8 cuttings at a time. For the cost of a few inexpensive materials and an hour of attention, you are not just making more plants, you are building confidence, skill, and a kind of independence that every gardener understands deeply. Months from now, when your shelves are fuller or your garden beds are thicker, and someone asks where all those beautiful plants came from, there is something deeply satisfying about being able to say, "I grew them myself." That is what the old biology teacher understood so well. Give them the conditions they already know. It sounds like a lesson about plants, but it is really a lesson about life. Healthy growth does not come from drowning something, crowding it, or forcing it into the wrong environment. It comes from creating the right conditions and then giving that growth time to happen. So now I would love to hear from you. What plant are you going to clone first? And do you think it belongs in Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3? Tell me in the comments below. I always love hearing what you are growing. And if this video gave you a new way to think about propagation, be sure to subscribe to Earthly Delights so we can keep learning, growing, and building greener lives together. Until next time, keep your hands in the soil and your heart open to everything the garden has to teach.